Hey everybody. Sorry I'm late. I was putting my daughter to nap and didn't realize it was 101. Okay, so this one is about topic I was going to do a YouTube video about, but then I thought there's really not much to see, so maybe it would be better live. Just gonna go find my notes, and if anyone has questions, that's really the main point to these live chats, is to post questions and comments and where you're from, so that you guys can talk to other people, maybe in similar locations, and help each other out. Can you hear me okay? Before I realize 10 minutes in that everyone's trying to read my lips. Like a couple months ago. That's where I put it. All right. Oh, a couple people from Pennsylvania, Ireland. How are the local bees doing there in Ireland? I forgot to look up. I wanted to Google that to learn a little bit more about them. Okay, so welcome everybody to the live chat. It's something I do the first Friday of the month, every month, 1 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time, whatever time that happens to be for you. We don't observe daylight savings. So now that you guys just observed it in other areas of the world, it changes a little bit. I think you're now, it's like 6 hours ahead on the East Coast. Okay, great. Thanks for letting me know that you can hear. And definitely everyone leave questions and I'll get to them as I see them. If you're a member or a student of my online beekeeping course, I added another live chat that is going to be on the third Tuesday of every month at the same time, 1 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time. But that's not for anyone on YouTube. You will get a link to that via email or in the community board of the memberships in YouTube. Okay, so get to it. I did see one question. Dawn says, how long after installing a new package should I begin worrying about Varroa mites? I know. Immediately, I suppose. I'm just kidding. I really recommend asking the people that you got the package from what they did about Varroa mites. Some places do treat that spring before they give you the package or the nuke. So I ask them first. 1 second, I'll ask my son to be a little bit quieter. Thanks. So when it comes to Varroa mites and you've just started beekeeping, you have a nuke or a package, what I recommend is not doing a mite test those first few months. You really want to make sure that you are good at queen spotting and that you're not going to accidentally kill her. Even if you're doing something like the powdered sugar roll, there's still a chance that you could harm the queen or she might fly off in that process. So I would really, if the place you bought your package from doesn't do anything for mites in the spring before they sell the package or nuke, then I would put a treatment in a couple months into having your bees. I wouldn't worry about it immediately. Some people do it before they install the bees. It just seems like overkill because a package of bees, over 90% of the Varroa mites in a beehive are in with the pupating bees. not that many of them are actually feeding off of the adult bees. So I wouldn't worry that you have too many mites on your bees at that point. The mite population should be pretty low in your hive. It's just ideally you would put in a treatment before the big honey harvest comes in. Now, your first year, there's a good chance you're not going to harvest any honey. So you have a lot of wiggle room there. Ideally, you want to put in a treatment so that it comes out before like the big bloom starts. Most treatments are in the hive for 6 weeks, so you just want to backtrack. So say you're in Pennsylvania, you would maybe want your treatment out by like end of June, say summertime. So then you would want to treat by mid-May. A little bit earlier maybe, but if your bees are still just like under 4 frames of brood, I would rather give my bees a chance to really just get up and running, and not worry so much about tainting your honey and the honey harvest. Worst case scenario, if your bees are like just really bringing in a bunch of honey, you just take a marker and mark those frames. I put a P on top, stands for poison. That means you don't want to harvest anything from any of those frames that were in the hive during a treatment. There are treatments that can be in the hive and you can consume that honey. I just personally don't like to. What I think is most important is that your bees are healthy. So formic acid, that can really disrupt the hive when it's just getting up and running in the springtime. You really want that queen to just start laying. You want the bees to be building. You put something like formic acid in the hive, it can really disrupt the hive. It disrupts like the pheromones that the queen is releasing. It's hard for the bees to really pick up on that. So I would really let the bees like fill up a box, or at the very least fill up a half to 3/4 of that first brood box before you think about putting a treatment in your first year. And of course, if like see a big honey season starts and you just want to do something really fast, you can do oxalic acid. Well, but brood is still present, so with oxalic acid, even then you have to administer it once a week for like 5 weeks in a row. But I wouldn't worry about it until your bees have filled up at least half of that first brood box, and the queen is really up and running and established, and the bees have filled out comb on at least 6 frames. You have a little bit of honey and at least 4 frames of brood, and before you start worrying about varroa mites. And it's really not the worst thing if you have to put a treatment in when there's honey. You just it's more so some treatments you can't put in when it's getting really hot out. So if you live in a place where it's like, in the 90s, that's when Apiguard and the formic acid have regulations on how much to put in or whether you can't put it in at all. If you are having any other technical difficulties, like hearing me twice, if there's an echo, I would log out and log back in, because there's nothing I can do about that. I think that might just be an internet thing or a weird glitch with YouTube. So just to get started in the topic, and then I'll get into some of the questions other people have. There's some things that I have done that aren't really too difficult, but have had some pretty good results when it comes to beekeeping. And there was one thing I wanted to mention. I saw someone commented about using burlap, and that was something that I've heard of beekeepers using as smoker fuel. And I've tried it once or twice, and it really burns. I thought it burned really hot, because I would literally see like sparks coming out of the front little spout of the smoker. But then one person said that there's a lot of burlap sacks that are treated with chemicals. So Be careful with using burlap, especially if like the burlap I tried was just from a coffee farm. They the coffee farm I was working on, they just had bags that were already like too far gone and holes in them and stuff. And so they will treat coffee bags with this like pesticide to deter something. I think is moths from eating the bags, and then there's other things like to prevent mold and stuff like that. So I would stay away from the burlap unless you know a little bit more about the source of it, and make sure that it wasn't treated with those chemicals. Not just for the bees, but for your own safety. You don't want to be smelling that, inhaling it. So number one, this is probably the absolute best thing you could do for your bees if you find that they're not doing well. So this isn't for everybody. This isn't going to work for every hive. But if your bees are just like meh all the time, especially if you have more than one hive and both of those hives are doing poorly. If you have more than one hive and one hive is doing well and the other hive is doing poorly, this might not be for you. But changing your location by a half a mile, it is really one of the best things you could possibly do for your bees. And I know it's not ideal for beekeepers to move their bees. I bought this bee carrier from Man Lake a long time ago, and it's this metal thing that opens up and you put it around a beehive, and it has these little pieces that go into the handholds, and it makes it really easy for two people to move a beehive together. Highly recommended if you do ever have to move beehives. My husband, he was so mad at me once I bought one, and he knew that I had known about these things, and I just made him lift up the beehives with me and put them on the truck. And he was like, "You knew this thing existed and you didn't buy it? Like, this is so stupid." Anyway, it's not fun to have to move a beehive, but if they're small, it's not that difficult. And it really, if the hive is just like a brood box for months and months, and it's like a month into summertime, really, your last resort is to move them. Otherwise, they're going to just not really do well, probably for the rest of the year, and you're just going to end up feeding them through winter. Um, other other than that, they might just have tracheomites or nosema, but there's a good chance that they're just in a poor location, especially if it's more than one hive. If it's just one hive, then there's a chance that it's another issue. And you really only have to move them just a little bit. You don't have to move them that far. Um, Next thing is the feeding syrup. And I used to think that you could just give the bees honey. It was just a matter of feeding them, like giving them food. But that's not the case. I even thought that giving them honey might be better for them because it's their food. It's the food that they're naturally supposed to be eating. But if your bees are not doing that well, or if it's springtime and your bees are small and you want them to build a little bit faster, grow a little bit faster, build comb a little bit faster, you want the queen to lay a little bit more, or if your bees were growing a lot and then they kind of stopped, which sometimes happens when one nectar season ends and it's a little bit slow before another nectar season starts. So you can feed them syrup inside the hive, of course, not outside, as that is very bad for your honeybees to have a food source like that outside the beehives near them. But you feed them inside the hive, and you don't want it to be more than 1 part water, 1 part sugar. Like, you don't want more sugar than that. You can have a little bit more water, but you don't want it to be more than 1 to 1, 50% sugar. And that is by, no, wait, I always forget. I believe it is by volume. Um, but anyone, if you're watching this, Let me know if I'm wrong about that. What that does is it just makes the bees think that there's a nectar flow going on. So you're tricking them into getting them to work a little bit faster. Because what's going on is you have a queen that's not going to lay a lot because she doesn't think that there's a nectar flow going on. The bees, if they don't think that there's excess honey coming in and there's not a flow going on, they're not going to be building a bunch of comb. They have to consume a lot of honey in order to secrete beeswax and build this comb out. And this is all just this balance act that goes on within the hive. And so when this nectar flow starts, that's when everything just like this domino effect. The nectar's coming in, bees are building comb, they're filling up cells with food, the queen starts laying more. You're probably also going to need to feed them pollen if you see that there's a lack of pollen in the hive so that they have something to feed the larva as well. And this just is like this boost to the hive and helps them grow a little bit faster. So giving them honey isn't going to be the same thing because it doesn't matter how much they literally have stored up. It depends on how much is coming in at that moment. And that will decide how much the queen lays. The bees, they're not just, they're, they're cautious, I guess, for lack of a better word. They're not going to just build and build and build. They are thinking about this a little bit more than maybe you realize, and they want to make sure that they're not using up their resources. So that nectar flow is what starts everything. So if there isn't a nectar flow going on, you can fake one for them. You just have to make sure it seems like nectar, because if there's too much sugar in there, it's not going to seem like nectar, and then that's not going to make the bees think that a nectar flow is going on. Another thing is checkerboarding, which is something I will probably make a video about. And I don't know if there are other terms for it, but it's literally when you just take frames within your beehive in the brood section. You can really do this anywhere in the beehive, it can work. But if you take frames that are built out, that have like especially brood on them, and you put an empty frame in between them. And so now there's this gap within the brood nest. And what will happen is the bees seem to be a little bit more inclined to fill up that frame. Now, maybe not. I don't really know why this works. It might be that they just don't like that gap. And so they're a little bit faster to fill it up, or it might just be because it's there. But I am not an entomologist and I don't want to claim to be one. I just know what I see and what I've observed. And if you have a box and you have, like, say 4 frames of brood and then a frame of honey on either side, so you kind of have like the brood sandwich. The honey is the bread, honey and pollen is the bread, the brood is in the middle, and then you have empty frames on the outside. So if you take 1 or 2 empty frames and checkerboard them in between frames of brood, you don't want to put 2 frames together that are empty. You don't want a huge gap in your brood. You just want 1 empty frame in between brood frames. That just kind of it can encourage the bees to fill up those empty frames a little bit faster, instead of just putting the bees in the middle and waiting for them to move out. And this is the same thing for top bar hives, long 9-straw style hives. Really, any kind of hive that has some kind of bar or frame the bees are building comb off of that are movable, you can continue to put empty space in between frames. And so then I also do this for my supers. I will take, if I'm putting an empty honey super on top of my hive, I will take a frame of honey if I don't have any that I can take from down below. Like, say I only have deep frames. Now I'm putting some shallow honey supers on top. I have a chest freezer where I have stored up frames of honey, and I will put that into an empty box. I almost never put an empty box with 10 empty frames onto a beehive and wait for the bees to build up. They will when they want to, when they need to, but you can encourage them to go up a little bit faster by putting a couple of frames of honeycomb in there. And the same thing if you're putting your second brood box onto your hive. Instead of just putting an empty box with 10 empty frames on top of your first brood box, you can take some frames of brood and honey and put them in your second brood box. So instead of you having one fully drawn out 10 frame brood box and a brood box on top that's totally empty, it can have 4 frames of brood in one box and 4 frames of brood in the other box, and there can be more empties in both boxes. It's just important when you start to move brood around like that you have a frame of food on either side of the brood to just like keep them warm. The brood has to stay warm. It's not just needs to stay like 70 or 80 degrees. It needs to be about like somewhere around like 98 degrees, I believe. So you want to have that insulated with some food on either side. Or if the brood frame has food on one side and brood on the other, then that should be sufficient as well. Okay, so I'll get to some questions before I get to more suggestions from my list. Santa Claus. Round Hills CC podcast says, if I have a lot of brood but very few new eggs, should I worry? It's something to write down in your notes and to keep an eye on. If there's not enough room, then you want to give them space. Bees that do really well to start and then slow down, that can be a sign of nosema or tracheal mites. So that's something you want to keep an eye on. If they don't if the population seems to slow down quite a bit, look into places that you can get your bees tested, because that's the only way to for sure diagnose it. You can feed them syrup, like I just mentioned, because it's possible that a nectar flow just ended or slowed down, and so the bees are slowing down and the queen's slowing down. It's really just, if you're still seeing eggs, then you don't have to worry too much, but it is still something to keep an eye on it to see how long it continues. Happy Bark says, I bought the Victor Mite heat treatment since Mighty Mite isn't producing. Oh, I didn't know there's another person making it. That's great. I have never used one before. When I heard about them, they weren't, well, when I first heard about them, I had a lot of bees and it just wasn't feasible for me to do something like that. I had a lot of bees and none of my bees are at my property. So I just couldn't stand there for hours, and I couldn't use the property owner's power to power these they have to like run for like 3 or 4 hours, I believe. So it wasn't really something that I could do, but I kept recommending it to my students, but people kept saying that they couldn't find them to purchase. So definitely let me know if you can email me when you try it to see how it works. What's it called? Victor Mite. Trelawney Labar says, I recently heard hives can become more aggressive in summer or late summer months. Is this true? I'll just still enjoy our backyard. Yeah, they very much so. It's aggressive bees. It's often a sign of a nectar season ending. When the bees go from really active to not so much to do, they can be really aggressive. It possibly is because there's sounds very much like humans when you think about it this way, but the hive population is really high, and if the hive is just kind of full because the bees aren't busy doing what they were doing, then they just kind of get aggressive for a little bit, for a few weeks, until the hive population goes down, the queen doesn't lay as much. It can also happen if your hives have a Varroa mite infestation. And so as the hive population gets high in the summertime, and then Varroa mite levels always increase with hive population levels, and so you'll often see the Varroa mite populations get really high once your beehives start to get really, really high. And then your beehive will get smaller, but then the Varroa mite levels are now really high as a result of that beehive population being high just a few weeks ago. Yeah, depending on how big your backyard is, it might not be a great space for your beehive. It can make mowing the lawn. One second. Can you turn the TV on? Sorry. My husband and son are counting the change from his large change jar. Sounds like a bank in here. Um, if you have kids and pets, especially, I don't recommend having bees in your yard if you have under a half an acre of property. And they come around the house and the lights at the house at nighttime. And if you have a pool, then it's going to make it even harder. Cheryl McAfee says 4 strong hives here in Canton, Ohio, 2 from last year's swarms and 2 that have wintered over second winter snow today. Wow, nice job. That's great. Swarms can be really great bees. Sometimes they're not. It depends on why they swarmed. But if they were big swarms, then they can be some of the best bees. Eric Pollock says, I'm installing a package in just under 2 weeks. When I do that, can I use entrance feeders? Can I use entrance feeders at the entrance, or can I just set the entrance feeder on top of the frames of the deep box? I would put it inside. I don't know. I've never used an entrance feeder. If it's inside the hive, but like the bees have to be inside the hive to get to the feed, it might be fine. But the safest way, so that you're not attracting any robbing, is to put it inside the hive. You would have, your deep box that you install your bees into, and then put another deep or one of your honey boxes on top of that and put the feeder inside that empty box. Some people use a queen excluder in between their boxes so that bees aren't flying up in there. I haven't found that bees do that. When you're first installing the bees, they just start to fill up inside the frames. But you can use your queen excluder above your first deep box where the bees are, and then put your feeder on top of that. Chuck says, I do it by volume, but not 100% scientific. That's the 1-to-1 syrup. He does it by volume, not weight. I believe that's what you're supposed to do, because water and sugar don't weigh the same amount. Okay. Is that a lizard on the window? Probably. It's termite season. Yeah, there's the to do it the opposite. There he is. It's termite season, so there's a lot of termites visible in the house, and when that happens, the lizards just come out of the woodwork and they are everywhere. I'm also going to be bottling honey, and so I have a honey in a bucket warmer, and I've been stirring it up every so many hours to get the crystallized honey on the bottom to come up, and that also attracts their attention. The bucket is 3 feet from where the lizard is. I dripped a little bit of honey onto the blanket down next to it that the bucket's sitting on top of. So I think he's also especially interested in that. George Ashmore says, hi from South Carolina. I have 2 nukes I'm installing tomorrow. I've got 2 brood boxes. Should I start with 1 and add the second in a couple weeks? Yes. Start with 1 brood box and add the second once the first brood box is 75% full. And you have 2 to 4 empty frames in there, then you can add the second one on, however long that takes. When it comes to the volume of pollen patty to feed, I start off small. I very rarely feed pollen because once you've it's been a really like a decade since I've fed pollen to bees because once you have bees, there's a point at which bees will fill their hive with pollen when they want to start swarming. They kind of just like plug up the brood nest with pollen to get the queen to stop laying. So once you start to see that, since I don't use foundation, it's really easy to just cut out those pieces if it's not a full frame of pollen. And I just keep that frozen and put that into frames when I need to. But if you need pollen patties, I would put the smallest little bit in. In Pennsylvania, my bees didn't usually eat much pollen. I would put like that big slab in and I could hardly notice much gone. It really depends on your location. But here where we have small hive beetles, those beetles they get really slimy. The larvae start to eat that stuff and the bees for whatever reason don't seem to care. They don't man it, and then once it gets slimy the bees do not touch it and they just like move away from it. So if you have small hive beetles present visible in your hives at this time of year, be very careful and use a really small amount of pollen patty. uh, it's pretty easy. You just put a little bit in, like put a half or a quarter in, and just see what happens. If it's warm enough to still be able to check on your bees, then it's going to be up above the bees. You don't have to disrupt the bees. You just peek under the lid and see if they're eating it, see if there's any left, and throw some more in if you need to. It's okay if it's just a couple days later or a week later. You don't need to smoke her. I mean, you should put a veil on and stuff. But I would start out small, start out with a quarter of like the patty first and work your way to larger amounts if they need it. And just be really careful about the small hive beetles eating it. Do you use green drone frames to help with Varroa? I don't use foundation. I am going to do a video about comb honey. Maybe a separate video about foundationless beekeeping. They're going to be longer ones because I think it's just easier to make a long video that's just like from start to finish, being foundationless to harvesting comb honey and that whole process. So yeah, if you are going to use foundation, definitely put in a couple of green drone frames. You don't have to do it in the first box. What I found that bees, without using foundation, I don't see a lot of drone comb in my first brood box. Is the second brood box that they can put a lot of drone comb in there. And once that frame is full of capped drone comb, and I put it in the freezer to lower varroa mite levels. Now, you don't have to do this. If you want to see what hives do well on their own and deal with varroa mites on their own so that you know what hives to breed from and to split, then don't do this because it's going to interfere with the results and you're not going to know which bees can deal with varroa mites naturally without human intervention. But once you have a hive that's starting to get varroa mites because you're doing mite tests and you're seeing mites on bees, or you're pulling out some of those drone pupa and you're seeing mites on them, then it's good to lower the mite levels of these beehives so that they don't become a breeding ground for varroa mites. So either have frames with no foundation in the hive that the bees can build whatever size comb they want to, or put in some drone foundation. I would say at least 2 frames of that green drone foundation for every beehive. And then freeze it once it is capped. But if you have a hive that has low mite levels and a great hive that you want to breed from, then I would not just freeze all your drones because then they're not able to spread those genetics. And that's not good for the honeybees. Becky says, I received a package of bees and within 4 days they were attacked and killed by bull ants. I have never heard of bull ants. How do you know that the ants were the ones that killed them? Like, did you see them going into the entrance and stuff? It's interesting. Um, I'll have to look into that. I've never seen a hive die from ants personally here or in Pennsylvania, but I'm sure it really depends on where you live and what kind of ants there are. Here I'll see ants in my hive, but they're really just looking for a home. I see them walking around carrying eggs and stuff when I take boxes apart, if I've disturbed their nest. I just ask because sometimes you see a hive that's collapsed and you see um, an insect in there and you assume that they're the ones that did it. Like people will see hives here slimed out. It's like so super slimy and small hive beetles and the small hive beetle larvae all over the place. And they assume that that's what killed the bees. But actually what happened is that the small hive beetles are just really quick to see that a hive is empty or they're already in the hive. And it's a very short gestation period from that beetle laying an egg to that egg hatching and being a worm that's going to be crawling around, and that slime is their feces. So a hive will abscond because they have a Varroa mite infestation. Hives that are heavily infested will take off. And I mean, not always, but it's very common. It's kind of like a last resort for them to abandon the infested brood. And then those hive beetles just go crazy. And 3 days later, you see a hive that's just slimed out, and there's almost no bees, and you assume that it was the beetles, but they just took advantage of an empty beehive. So that's the only reason why I asked, because that's a really common thing for people to do with the small hive beetles, is to blame them for the hives collapsing. All right. I'll get to some more questions. I just wanted to mention a few more things. So these are things that you can do to help your bees that can have big results on your hive's performance. One is to have a water source for your bees, not just when it gets hot out, but all the time. It's actually best to do it before the bees even arrive, so that because when bees already have a water source, it's really hard to get them to change to a new water source. Say your neighbor's pool, it's really hard. You can't just put out the best water source and then expect them to change it. And then one of my students had mentioned that Frederick Dunn had a post about adding salt. He says 1 teaspoon of salt to 1 gallon of water, and you want uniodinated salt. Oh no, that's Michigan University. That's their recipe. But Frederick Dunn also has a video about that, and they say that it's good to add a little bit of salt to your water. And I already mentioned this, but moving your bees even a half a mile away can make a huge difference, like huge difference for your bees. It is the hardest part of beekeeping, not dealing with Varroa mites and small hive beetles, but finding a good place for bees. It has been the hardest part for me in the last 10 years of keeping bees, finding a good spot, because when they're in a good spot, you can make mistakes, they can make mistakes, bad things can happen, and they bounce back really quickly when they're in a good location. And then there's not a lot of competition for food. There's not a lot of bees nearby for Varroa mites to just bounce around and viruses to be spread. It's just like such a big difference for bees when they're in a good spot. Faking a nectar flow and giving them that 1-to-1 sugar syrup by volume. Of course, keeping the bee space. So when you have an empty box and a new beehive, you want to put 10 frames in your 10 frame box, 8 frames in your 8 frame box. You want your top bars to be the appropriate space between them, so that it's like 3/8 of an inch. You don't want to have 9 frames in that 10 frame box to start. Once they've already drawn out the comb, then you can spread it out a little bit more. But you can have cross comb and burr comb and bees. Even with foundation, you can still see that bees will build off of the foundation in very odd ways when you have more of a space. I really should post this, make a video of this. The beekeeping museum I used to work for at Big Island Bees, the owner, before he took over his dad's business, he still does it. He makes sculptures where he makes a sculpture out of metal or wax. There were all these wax heads, like life-size beeswax heads, all along this shelf in the museum in the back, and he puts them in a box like this, the size and shape of a beehive if it was like say 3 boxes tall, but it's just a wooden box. And he would have like a little plexiglass window he could look in, and he would put the sculpture in there, and he would put a colony of bees inside, and the bees would build honeycomb off of his sculpture. And then once he was happy with what they had done, where he would take it out and move things around, cut stuff out, and when he was done with it, he would leave it outside for ants and stuff to clean up and take the honey and stuff out, and then put it in a plexiglass box and sell it for like $40,000. He had stuff, he traveled all over the world with these wax sculptures, and was at the Guggenheim with his sculptures. And it's really interesting to see what bees will do when they do not have that bee space, is all I'm getting at. It can be really beautiful. It's super interesting. I don't know if you've ever seen other pictures. People have put like figurines and ceramic pieces into a box in their beehive and watched, or like taken some frames out of their hive and let the bees build honeycomb off of these figurines. And it's interesting. But if that's not what you're going for, then make sure you have a bee space. There are frame spacers. I believe they're just for honey supers so that you can save time harvesting. So instead of having 10 frames in that box that you have to uncap and spin, you can have, I think it's like 7 or 8 frames, and the frames are especially fat and a lot heavier. Without a frame spacer, it can be a little bit tricky. Otherwise, what I recommend doing is putting 10 frames in a 10 frame box. And once they've filled out, like drawn out the comb, or at least half of the comb on 9 of those frames, take that last empty frame out, and then you can space out the frames once there's comb on all of the frames. But with empty frames, you cannot just put 9 frames in a 10 frame box and think that the bees will build in a nice straight line. Checkerboarding your frames, I mentioned earlier, is really helpful. So that just means that if you have 5 frames of brood all next to each other, take an empty frame and put it in the middle of those 5 frames of brood. So you have 2 frames of brood, an empty frame, 3 more frames of brood, and they will build in that empty frame, or they can, a little bit faster than if you just have the empty frames on either side and wait for the bees to expand. I do not use queen excluders, and I don't recommend them. There are times that they can be helpful, but I don't think it's something that you should start out with. Definitely don't put a queen excluder on your first hive. And this is mostly for beginners. If you are looking to keep your brood down to 1 box for whatever reason, there are different ways that people beekeep, and they prefer to just have 1 brood box for brood and all the rest for honey. But when you're getting started and what you're concerned, your primary goal should be to just keep your bees alive. Like, don't try to make everything perfect, but just have this goal to keep your bees alive for an entire year, which is a pretty big goal to have. So if that is your goal, a queen excluder can encourage the bees to swarm a little bit sooner, because otherwise the queen would go up into honey supers and start laying. And that's not ideal, but it's not the end of the world if you just have some frames with baby bees on them. You just take that frame that the queen's on, you can pick her up by her wings and put her back down into the brood box. You can take that frame she's on and just like give her a little nudge off the frame so she falls into the brood box. Whatever you're more comfortable with. And then that brood in that box that she laid in will hatch and the bees will go back to filling it up with honey. If she keeps on moving up, then you can exclude her with a queen excluder, but I don't recommend keeping them on. It can really deter the bees from going past it to upper boxes. They will, but they might do it a little bit slower. And if you don't use foundation, like I don't, my drones can get really big. And I've seen a lot of dead drones in queen excluders, like literally just their heads one end and the rest of their body is the other end, and they just starve to death, like stuck through the slats of the queen excluder. So that's not ideal. If you use foundation, then the cell size is standard and your drones probably won't be too big for the queen excluder. Queens still can get past queen excluders also. So if you're not finding your queen, look up in your honey super because that might be where she is. Another suggestion I have is to keep your inspections down to 20 minutes or less. Don't pull out every single brood frame. Have your inspection sheet. All my videos have a link to an inspection sheet you can download for free from my blog. And just go through it. And once you have a good idea of what's going on in your hive, that's enough. Don't bother the brood too much. They don't want you to bother them, and you are just a visitor. You're not their boss. And so usually when you open a hive, I feel like that's just like a general impression that most people have, is that they kind of tiptoe around and they know that they're not in charge here. They might not even be welcome, and to not intrude too much. Also, when you're first getting started, you should really see those first couple months as the learning time. Spend as much time as you can just outside the hive, observing the entrance. That will tell you a lot about how much pollen is coming in, how active the bees are, whether you're seeing robbing. And then also, when you're opening your hive, to use that as a time to work on your queen spotting, because you don't have to find the queen when checking your hive. And most of the time, you don't need to see her, but there are times when you will want to spot her, and it's always good to just be good at queen spotting. I have a video about queen spotting, and my number one tip that my former boss gave me was to just, when you pull out a frame, the first thing you do is look for the queen. Just spend 5 seconds looking for her, and then flip it over to the other side. Spend 5 seconds looking for her there too. And then you can look around at other stuff. But she can hide. It's very common. Some queens are very skittish, and they will hide, and they will run to the other side that does not have the sunshine facing down on them. So the first thing you want to do when you pull out that frame is look for her, and then do other stuff and work from the top down. Now, you might read like that a queen can fly away when opening a hive and all this stuff, but that's why you don't want to spend too much time, and that's why you don't want your inspections to be really long. You don't want to leave a frame of brood sitting out on the ground leaning up against your hive, but you still want to make it one of your goals, your priorities, that first month or two, to just get familiar with the beehive, because there's really only so much you can learn from watching videos and reading and all that stuff. You just have to do it and practice. It's like any other skill. You really just need to practice. So you should see those inspections as not just checking on your bees, but you yourself are at practice, working on your beekeeping skills. And then, not to start maybe, but then you should take off your gloves. Because if you have really aggressive bees for some reason, then, don't. But I don't like to keep bees with gloves on. I don't like to open hives. I will, of course, move bees with gloves on. I don't like that can make them aggressive. And there are times of the year when the bees can get aggressive, and I will put gloves on. But overall, I don't like to open beehives with gloves on. And you know what? Just making yourself a little bit more exposed, and you have something to lose as well, I think makes you a little bit more aware of what you're doing, a little bit less likely to drop a frame or to squish a bee when you have to move slow so that you aren't getting stung and you aren't in pain. And then you're even less likely to cause harm to the bees around you. Um, it's there was definitely a learning curve for me. There, the first time I took my gloves off, I think I got stung on my hand like 7 times, and I put the gloves back on. I think some of it was just nerves to start, and maybe the bees picked up on it, or maybe it was just bad timing. But uh, and I will get stung on my hands, and it hurts. But now I don't swell up like I used to. And unless you do have like a reason for really not wanting to get stung once in a while when opening your hive, I really recommend not wearing gloves. The veil, of course, it's good to protect your eyes and your face. I worked with a guy that was stung on his eyeball. He was fine. He can see still, but not what you want to happen. I've been stung up my nose a couple of times, and I've had a bee fly into my ear. So veils are good, but I do recommend not wearing gloves when you're ready. It'll make you a better beekeeper. Let's see. Donald says, may purchase an easy hive. The never had bees before. Any advice? Well, I've never worked with that style hive or seen them in person. I've just seen videos of them. They look super cool. But they would be really great here because it's really, really hot in the sun. Um, Also, really great in cold areas where you have a really cold winter. Um, Never had bees before. Any advice? I don't have any advice for that hive style. My main advice is, I'd say the best advice I got from another beekeeper was to not ask yourself, how can I get my bees to do so and so or whatever it happens to be at the time, and say to yourself, what are my bees trying to do and how can I help them? And to see yourself as you're helping the bees. It's their life, it's their colony, it's their decision for what they want to do, and it's your goal to help them out. Not every hive is going to survive, and definitely don't feel like it's your responsibility to keep every hive alive. And with that kind of mentality and frame of mind, I think that it'll be a little bit easier to problem solve and to just keep going when you're not quite sure what to do. Uh, Edward says install 2 nukes this morning. Have 1-to-1 sugar syrup. When should first inspection take place? I would give them a good week. Well, 2 nukes. Okay, so since you have a nuke, then your queens are not caged, and then you want to give them a good week. Definitely hang out next to the beehives. Start to watch their activity from the entrance. Um, and then in a week you can open it up, but keep the inspection really short. Just do it on a day when it's not too cold or too windy, not raining or anything like that, and just keep it a really short inspection just to make sure that the queen is there, that she's roaming around, that there's some brood, and that like if feed needs to be added or anything like that. And for everybody, when you're giving bees sugar syrup, keep an eye on it and make sure it's not going bad. Usually adding a supplement like Pro Health or Honeybee Healthy or Hive Alive or whatever it is can prevent it from going bad, but still keep an eye on it, especially if it's really warm outside, because that syrup can spoil in the heat. Any recommendations on when I should add my honey super? The honey super gets added once the box well, the uppermost box is 3/4 of the way full. There's really not a set time. It's going to vary. It's not going to be the same time for every beehive in the apiary. Though, I mean, if you're like a commercial apiary, you're just going to throw them on every single beehive at the same time. But it's just whenever they need it. So once there's, uh, just a few empty frames, 2 to 4 empty frames in a box, then that's when you add another box on. And you just keep giving them more space. Or with the top bar, then you just keep pulling out that follower board and giving them more and more frames to build on. Emmanuel says, highly interested in comb honey. I think extraction is too much work. Any initial tips for the spring? Extraction is really intense with an extractor, but then it's like over in a day. And that's pretty nice too. I have a bucket of honey over there, and it's really nice to just have honey in one big bucket that cost me like $10 for the bucket, and that's it. So once the honey is harvested, the storage of it is super easy and cheap and will last a long time. And that's the pain with the comb honey. Initial tips for comb honey. There's a lot of ways to do it. I just recommend making sure you have a way to store it so that it doesn't go bad. The best way to store it is to put it in jars with honey, in glass jars with honey with a lid, so that it doesn't go bad. Or you can just put the entire frame without uncapping it or cutting it up at all into a chest freezer. The problem where you're going to come across with comb honey is that it crystallizes, and then it's not quite the same. So if it's in a jar with liquid honey, the liquid honey is going to crystallize. So if there is honey in your area that takes a long time to crystallize, go with that honey, and don't just do comb honey for any kind of honey out there. There's just a lot of parts to it, and it can get complicated in the harvesting and sale and storage of it. Definitely freeze it. Freeze it before you consume it, or before it's going to be stored for more than a couple days. And don't freeze your jars with labels on them. The one place I worked for did that. They labeled everything and then put it in the freezer, and the labels fell off, of course. Gary says that there's a beekeeping club in Grass Valley that meets every month. So there you go. Maybe you will be able to check it out. That sounds nice. One person says, my girls are still under 4 feet of snow. I have the air conditioning on right now. I don't normally turn the air conditioning on when it's still in the low to mid 80s, but for some reason yesterday and today, it's in the 80s. The sun is just hot, and I did a lot of running errands with a 2-year-old, and I am just done with it. Junebug says, do bees sense earthquakes? Probably. Here on the Big Island, where we have an active volcano, one of the people in my bee class had asked about that. And she lived in Volcano, which is a town where the Kilauea Volcanoes National Park is. And there was a really big flow. I think about 5 years ago, I want to say I was pregnant with my son when I was kind of concerned about the level of the air quality was really, really poor. And the volcano was just going off, and There was just a lot of earthquakes. Not too bad here, but in the volcano town, a lot of people had just left because there was just so many earthquakes going on. And she had asked about if that would affect her bees, and I was like, probably. I mean, I'm sure they will feel the vibration on the ground just like we do. I don't know if they can predict earthquakes, like if they can feel them before we feel them, but a lot of people had moved their bees from that area because the bees might stay, but they might be just a little bit more aggressive. There's a book called Why Dogs Hump and Bees Get Depressed, I believe is the name of it. Let me look it up. I read this book. Yeah, that's the name of the book. Why Dogs Hump and Bees Get Depressed. And it's a bunch of stories about experiments done on animals. And one experiment was done on bees. And they found that what they did was they shook a beehive. And, like every so often, and they saw how its activity changed. And what they found was that the beehive actually didn't get aggressive. What they did was they just described them as depressed. Now, I really shouldn't be summarizing this because I read this over 5 years ago, so it's been a while. But I believe that they just found that their activity slowed down. They acted similar to how they act when they have no queen, because the queen releases pheromones that can encourage the bees to be more active. And so when a hive is queenless, bees are usually described as kind of having this depressed way about them. And that was the same thing that they found when they were shaking this hive repeatedly, like day after day. I don't remember how often they ended up shaking the hive to get them to have this depressed demeanor. But there's probably be a similar response. Did you think that I would have so much to say about bees and earthquakes? Eric says there's a creek a half mile from my hives. Assume that's close enough for a water source. Yeah, probably. I mean, it depends on how hot it gets. That's great that it's fresh water because then there's minerals in there already. But if it's really hot in your area, you might want to put another water source a little bit closer so they don't have to fly a half a mile. They say that bees prefer a water source that's not immediately next to the hives, but probably a tenth of a mile would be a little bit better, or like at least 5 or 10 feet from your beehive. Sounds like Hawaii is crowded with apiaries. Oh yeah, it's awful. It's terrible. There's a lot of not Hawaii. I don't really know what it's like on the other islands. I don't know many beekeepers on Kauai. The one student I have on Kauai makes it sound like his beehives are just like bursting with honey. I don't think beekeeping is too big or popular there, but on the Big Island is where it's known for the queen breeding, and that's where the big queen breeders are: Big Island queens and Kona queens. They're like sending out 10,000 queen bees per uh, what do you call it, customer. And then what people have said is that a lot of people will go work for them for a little bit, realize how easy it is, and then start their own queen breeding business. Pipik said that the lizard just came into the house. Oh my God, you have no idea how many lizards are in our house. Last week, I closed the bedroom door to my daughter's room, and there was a lizard in the door frame, and I didn't know it. I just closed the door, and then I opened the door later, and there was a squished lizard and just blood dripping down the door frame. And it's one eyeball I popped out. And that's not the first time I've accidentally squished a lizard by closing the door in my house. And our house is sealed up. This isn't, when we lived in the coffee shacks, they were way worse. There were lizards everywhere. Okay. Eve says, what does the ideal brood box look like? How much brood, bread, nectar, honey, empty frame? At what point of brood content do you want to add another brood box? I do have this. I'm not sure which chapter it is. I do have this in the online class too. I have it like labeled in there. I want to say it's like chapter 3 in the beginning of like how to inspect a hive. But what you're usually going to see, ideal doesn't matter. As long as your bees have food and there's eggs and larvae and pupa and a queen that's laying and they don't seem overly aggressive and the mite levels are low, it doesn't matter what your brood box configuration is. Usually what the bees do is the first frame is going to be food, honey, pollen, bee bread. You might have one frame of pollen and then a frame of honey, or it might be just a combination of honey and pollen, or it might just be honey. And then you're usually going to see a bunch of frames of brood, and then you're going to see that other last frame in the box is going to be more food, or it might be the last 2 frames of the box. That's usually what I see in my brood boxes. And then the second box, which people call the brood box, but it's going to be whatever the bees feel like doing in that box, unless you're putting a queen excluder on there. And that is usually half honey and half brood. I see a lot more drones in that box as a foundationless beekeeper. And some boxes are like all brood and just 2 or 3 frames of honey. And some of them are half honey, half brood. Some of them just have a couple frames of brood and are almost all honey and are really heavy. You'll see a lot. What you more so want to see is you just want there to be at least 1 frame of brood, 1 frame of honey for every 4 frames of brood. And you want to see bee bread on the brood frames. So every brood frame should have a rainbow at the top of nectar, honey, and bee bread, so that it's for easy access to get to the bees. Those other frames that you see of honey and pollen, those are just extra for when they need it. But mostly those brood frames, you want to see the food at the top so that that's where they're easy access to feed the bees, because they're feeding the bees all day long. But it really doesn't matter. Don't try to like move things around to how you think it should be. You like let them do it how they have set it up. And when you're inspecting it, have a way that you inspect your hives every single time, so there's no question as to what frame goes next. Pippa Cat says, I thought the reason for using the queen excluder was to prevent ending up with debris in your harvested honey. I've never heard of that. How would the queen excluder prevent debris from getting in your honey? Bees are going to be walking around on both of the frames, but no, I don't know. I've never heard of using a queen excluder to keep debris out of your honey. If anyone else has something to add to that, add it in the comments. Let me know. Gary says, add when there is a honey flow and crowded with bees. Yeah. He was taught that when you see extra wax building between the frames, we call it whiting of the combs just under your lids. Yeah, And you will see sometimes like little white beeswax under the lid. That's a sign that bees are building comb. Forget there's another thing you would want to do during that time. And you just keep adding. I mean, essentially, you just want to give them somewhere to go, somewhere to put it. That's really the simplest way to describe it. You're just giving them more space for their brood. I mean, for their honey. Um, and Mar Design says, how fast can bees build comb during a heavy flow? Gary says a frame a day when there's blackberry blooming here in Chico, California. They can fill a medium in 2 weeks in my area. They can fill a box in less than a month here during the Christmas berry season. And that's just really, it depends on your location, what's blooming, and how much competition there is, how fast bees can build. But they can build fast, so that gives you an idea of whether your bees are in a good spot or not. Because there's a potential for the bees to do really, really well when put in certain spots. Okay, nobody wants to take off their gloves. I see. That's fine. I mean, there's don't think about it until you've done it a little bit, and then then make a decision about the gloves. Uh, how about this? Go with the leather gloves at first, and then try some latex gloves, or like a couple of latex gloves, and see how that goes, and then try no gloves. Todd wants to know if it's okay to have chickens in the same general area as your hives. Yeah, it should be. I have never had really aggressive bees. I've had situations where my bees were aggressive for a few weeks. I've had times when my bees were really aggressive for a few months when there was construction going on the property next door. But I've never had like Africanized bees. So I can't really tell you how bees with those really aggressive genetics deal with chickens. But for most European honeybees, they are okay with chickens. I've definitely had my bees on properties where they had dogs and they had wild chickens, and I never saw any issues with it. Well, usually a dog will stick its nose somewhere around the beehive and then get stung and like never go within 20 feet of the hive ever again. Our dog used to eat the bees while they were flying in the air, like they were flying drops of honey or something. He was a yellow lab, and he would make this like sound with his tongue and his mouth like go shut. He would just like jump in the air and go catching them. He was stung on his face a few times and it swelled up, but that didn't deter him. Um, let's see. Gary says I've actually made 4 frame nukes in a 5 frame box. They built the whole comb, top to bottom, side to side, capped with manzanita water white honey because I left out that 5th frame. I don't do that anymore. Oh, Pippa Cat says when I say debris, I mean there will be no bits of larva, eggs, etc. when you harvest with no queen excluder. Um, if you don't put a queen excluder on, most queens that I have had don't go past the second box. They just don't. So in a yard of 20 hives, I'd say one beehive will have a queen that is just like, no, nothing can stop her. All she wants to do is lay a million eggs a day, and she will just keep going up to those uppermost boxes. If that happens and a queen goes into the upper boxes, you just you want to put the queen back down to the lower box and you let that brood hatch. Uh, then once the brood hatches, the cell will be empty. You can if you're harvesting and there's brood still in there that hasn't hatched yet, then you just don't want to harvest that frame. So if you are a commercial apiary or you're looking to sell and you want to harvest as much honey as possible, then you might want to put a queen excluder on. I would just still not put a queen excluder on until after the bees have moved up into that honey super and have started to clean out the frames and build comb. And then put that queen excluder on once there's cells that are fully drawn out that the queen can lie on if you really want to deter her. I mean, I worked for an apiary that had 4,000 hives, and they didn't use queen excluders until they started treating for Varroa mites. And until Varroa mites arrived here in Hawaii, and they had to start treating. And then for them, it was a lot faster to treat when they could take the honey supers off really fast and not have to worry about the treatments affecting the honey. Um, so yeah, I mean, it is possible that the queen can go up into that super and lay on those frames, but it's just, I'd say the benefit of no queen excluder outweighs the potential for a frame or two to not be able to be harvested. I mean, those frames can also just stay in the hive as winter feed. But the benefit is that if the queen doesn't have anywhere to lay in those first two brood boxes, she can go to upper brood boxes and start laying there, and the bees can start going up there and building comb, or you can prevent her from laying by having this queen excluder on there. And then the hive might just go and swarm off. So if you want to prevent swarming, then having that queen excluder off can buy you some time, and there's a little bit more wiggle room using that queen excluder. That's just one of those things that it's more of a commercial beekeeping thing, and it's for people that are maybe a little bit more advanced beekeeping that have been doing things a little bit longer. When you're just getting started and you are going to be making mistakes, I'd say to skip using some of these things that are going to make things harder for you, not easier. Because really, your first couple of years harvesting a lot of honey shouldn't be your goal. It is something that you should think about later on down the road once you've got a better grasp on the actual beekeeping part. So that's my recommendation. Of course, the best way to do this, because I came from working for a farm that did things a certain way, and then I got bees of my own because I wanted to try things my way. And that's just what I did. I just got a couple hives, I caught a bunch of swarms, and I built my own equipment, and I just tried things. My boss said that when you split a hive, you have to put it further away or else the bees will go back to the parent hive. So I just tried it. I split a hive and I put it next to the parent hive, and both hives were fine. There's just certain things you have to consider when splitting a hive and putting it within a couple feet of that parent hive. The best way to do some of these things is to just try it out and see what happens. There are some things that trying it out and seeing what happens could cause the hive to collapse. Like Varroa mites. But then there's other things like when it comes to equipment, that's just a beekeeper's preference. Foundationless versus using foundation, comb honey, extractors, flow hives, all that stuff is just your preference. That has not as much to do with the bee's health. So Pippa Cat says the norm in Ireland for beginners is one brood box and use an excluder. Interesting. So what's the benefit? I'm curious, the benefit to putting that excluder on just for the sake of saving your honey? Or is there another benefit to keeping your brood in one box? I mean, if you're treating, I guess that could make treating and the cost of the treatment lower. And maybe a little bit easier if all of your brood is just in one box. Um, but it's interesting to hear. Eve says, Larissa, I'm using foundation for brood, but we'll use foundationless for honey supers. I figured an excluder would help with that. Any better ideas? I don't think an excluder is going to make a difference whether you use foundation or not in your boxes. Well, I guess if you're not using any foundation in your brood, then I really don't recommend the excluder because the drones get stuck. But if you're just using foundationless in your honey, then the queen excluder is not going to make much of a difference. If anything, I guess the benefit to not using a queen excluder, if you're going to go foundationless in your honey supers, is that if the bees want to build drone comb, they can in honey supers. Queen might never go up there to see it, but possible. Curious Koi says, has anyone tried the less expensive Lysin polystyrene hives Lysin because they want a lighter box to lift? I know wood is more natural, but light has its own benefits. I have not. I know that the one hive style is plastic, and that's supposed to be better insulated because these wooden boxes are made of like pine, and they have terrible insulation, even though wood is natural. I mean, uh, it's really terrible for insulation. These cheaper boxes that we're buying, but I haven't tried it. If anyone else has tried it, add that in. If you want a lighter box to lift, I mean, the shallow boxes are like 30 to 40 pounds when full of honey. That would be the heaviest. Or just make sure your second deep box isn't a deep, but medium. You can go with all mediums. You can always just have an empty box next to you also. Put a couple frames in there before you pick up your box, and then put all the frames back in. You don't have to pick a box up when it's totally full. You can take some frames out before you move the box down, and then put the frames back in. Also, what really helps is to have like a table or a couple of boxes stacked up with a lid or a board on top. So when you're picking up a box off the hive and putting it down, you're putting it down the same height. So you're not putting it on the ground and then picking it up off the ground. Um, I guess not too high, so that you can still, ideally you would put it on its side so that you're not squishing all the bees underneath, but just having something to put it down that's not all the way down on the ground. One of the videos I made that's inspecting a hive, um, it's one of my recent videos. It's like open a beehive with me or something. I have one of those. Stands, and it's not a table, it's not a flat board, but it's just like four vertical legs with a horizontal bar um, between the legs, and then it is the height of like two boxes or something, And that makes beekeeping a lot easier because you're not putting that box down on the ground and you're not putting the box on something so that you're squishing bees underneath it. And so it's, even though it's heavy, it's really just that picking it up off the ground and putting it back down that I think is the hardest part to the weight. M. Smith says, don't you run the risk of the queen accidentally getting brushed out of the hive if the excluder is not used? I guess you mean when you're harvesting honey. Not really. I mean, there's a small risk, but there's like, when you're pulling a frame of honey out of the hive, you can use, these things work pretty well, assuming it's warm enough out. That like Fisher's Be Quick, I think is the name of it. It's definitely by Fisher's, and you spray it on. You can put it on a towel, or they have this black fabric thing that you put on top of the hive. Anyway, it has this smell that makes the bees go down. Or you can use a bee escape that goes inside a queen excluder, and essentially the bees go out of the box but then can't get back in. Or you can get, when you pick up the frame and it's full of bees and you want to harvest it, you just like do a really strong shake directly over into the hive, and all the bees will fall off the frame and into the hive. And there will literally just be a handful of bees walking around, and I just use a feather to brush those bees off. It's so rare that the queen goes into the higher than the second box of the beehive. She usually stays in those first two boxes, assuming that you continue to give them enough space. It's really not a problem, but when you're harvesting a frame, you really shouldn't take that frame covered in bees and brush all the bees off, because that's going to make them really mad. And I mean, people talking about aggressive bees, sometimes you have to consider how you're treating them, and that you might actually be making them a little bit aggressive towards you because of your treatment of them, week after week. So it just like, do a good shake. The bees will almost all fall off of the frame back into the hive, and it's a lot better than that. Just brushing a frame full of bees off, or using a blower, blowing those poor bees 20 feet away, making them come back to the hive. Eric says, Hoover hives are wax coated. Should they be painted or left natural? I don't think you can paint those. I don't really think the paint would stick to the beeswax, honestly. They're meant to not need painting on them. Pippa Cat says, I'm thinking more about weekly inspections. With no excluders, she could be anywhere. She just doesn't. She just really doesn't move up past that second brood box most of the time. But if you are concerned, by all means, use it. Try it on one hive and see what happens. But at the very least, just let the bees go into that box and clean it out. Don't put a totally empty box on your beehive with a queen excluder below it, and then wait like a month for the bees to slowly make their way up into that box. I don't recommend that. I get a lot of students asking me why the bees aren't taking to their flow frames, and I tell them, like, take the queen excluder off and just let the bees start to clean, and walk around and start to like just take to those frames before you put that queen excluder on, because the flow frames, you especially don't want the queen laying in those cells. I mean, the bees will clean it, but they're especially hard to clean, and they're expensive. So you don't really want to have to not harvest from one of those frames. Okay. I gotta go because it is getting late. Thanks to everybody for tuning in. I have, please feel free to ask questions. I will get to them later when I see them, or other people that are in the chat. I am putting my podcast episodes back up because the place that hosts my beekeeping class offers it. So I'm naming a podcast now Beekeeping Made Simple. It used to be called The Buzz About Bees. Every week I'm going to be adding that back in. I'm going to be putting my comb honey video on, but that's going to take a little while to do. And I have an affiliate program set up now. So if you are in a bee association or have a beekeeping blog or YouTube channel or Instagram or whatever way you know a lot of people that might be interested in beekeeping, if you go to beekeepingmadesimple.com/affiliate, or the bottom of the page, there's another navigation that has, like returns and exchange policy and affiliates and stuff like that. So if you go to the affiliate page at beekeepingmadesimple.com, you can fill out a form to become an affiliate. That is for anybody, but a good way for beekeeping associations and other people looking to make a commission. I offer a 30% commission. So if someone signs up for lifetime access, that means you make like $83 for that one sale. If someone signs up for like a monthly membership, you make that 30% off of every single month that they subscribe, and you get like whoever gets a coupon code and a link. So if the person uses the link or that coupon code, you get that commission. If they use that link and cookies are enabled, then that means that they have 60 days to make that purchase after using that link, and they will still be credited with that commission. And that's just my way to make it worth it for people. I know a lot of bee associations do classes, but what I found is a lot of people that take my classes online also take them in person, because they're the kind of people that see the value in learning from someone experienced. So if you belong to an association or took an in-person class, I would really appreciate it if you just contacted them and said that you recommend checking out my affiliate program. And that is about it. I'm just distracted because I see laughing emojis, and I'm curious what telling my friends I'm off to brand my hives. That's what Michael Bush does. He has a brand for his beehives. I interviewed him for the podcast, and he has a brand that's the calendar, and he has little pins. And when he inspects the hive, he puts a pin in for different things going on in the hive. And so the next time he checks his hives, he can see what happened in the last inspection. It doesn't really give him like a long-term look at the hive, but I guess he doesn't really find that necessary. He just wants to see like what was going on last time. So possible, what some people do. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. I know that it's hard to get everyone to be able to log in at the same time. And thanks for people that signed up for the membership and the online class. And the online class is free for the first month. So if you just want to check it out for free for the first month and then cancel, you're welcome to. It's pretty easy to cancel online, or you just email me and I'll cancel you for you. See you next month. And to members and students, I do another chat the third Tuesday of the month. Same time, same place. Bye. Have a great weekend.